Hi everyone, this is Ashley with CT Media Digitals. I'm going to do a tutorial to show how to use the new arch backdrops in Photoshop. I do have, so these are like actual backdrops. I do have if you're looking for something a little bit easier, because the full backdrops are a little bit harder to edit, I do have transparent PNG wall arches in my Etsy shop, and I also have just our PNG overlay just the arches themselves without the wall, so you can overlay them onto a backdrop like this. You can find both of those in my Etsy shop in the overlays, but I'll go ahead and start the tutorial for these ones. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go to my quick selection tool and click select subject. If you have the contextual taskbar open, you can use that if you want to. It gets in my way personally, so I like to just hide that and I'm pretty old school when it comes to editing. So, and then I'm going to make sure that she's selected pretty good. Her hair right here. And now I could extend this backdrop and create a layer mask and paste the backdrop into this, which can be a little bit easier because you're able to mask on and mask off the subject. When you're copying and pasting the subject onto the backdrop, it can be a little bit trickier to add in if you need to. Like for instance, if I copied and pasted her into there and there's a part of her dress or a part of her hair, finger, or arm, or anything that's missing, it gets to be a little bit of a pain in the butt. So I could come over here and I never edit, copy, edit, and paste into the image. And it did a pretty good job of that. But I can show you as well. If you come over here, and I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller, and you extend the backdrop kind of to the size. I would just do it large because you could always crop back down again. Go to your content aware or generative expand. Generative expand, in my opinion, Photoshop came out with an AI that does all this, and it makes it blurry. Like you can tell a very definite break in the extension. So I like to still use the content aware fill and then just fix it if I need to. It's more accurate in my opinion. Just wait for it to fill in the edges. And now that did an okay job. I'm not too concerned about the edges, obviously, because we're going to overlay the backdrop. It actually did a pretty good job on her dress, so for tutorial sake, I'm just going to leave that the way it is. Now, I'm going to go ahead and flatten this layer because it's open. It's not flattened right now. Okay, so again, I'm going to go to my quick selection tool and select subject. Instead of copying, I'm going to come over here, I'm going to duplicate my background layer and create a layer mask. And then I'm going to hold down Control or Command on Mac, +I on my keyboard to invert that layer. I'm going to come over here, I'm going to delete her. I'm going to select all, edit, copy, and edit and paste. Now, first off, I'm going to move it real quick. The light is coming from the opposite direction, so I can flip the backdrop or I can flip the person. If you're doing this for an actual client and not just for your portfolio, I suggest flipping the backdrop. So I'm just going to do that. Flip horizontal. I'm going to I'm going to click right up here to keep my proportions. Resize until it fills the backdrop. Click OK. I'm going to right click here, or you can hold down Alt and click between your layers, but I'm going to right click here and create clipping mask. And that's going to put it behind my subject. Now, I've seen a couple people want to keep their original floor just to make it a little bit easier. If you wanted to do that, you could come over to your layer mask and you could use your, oops, this thing gets in the way too. You could use your black brush at whatever opacity you wanted, but just to show you real quick. And you could brush on the floor. You'd have to kind of zoom in and make that. You would just have to paint all of that off and kind of blend in this area here, which is easier, but sometimes it just doesn't look right. And then that way you wouldn't have to paint in your shadows. You could use a white brush and lower the opacity and kind of feather it a little bit if you want. Much lower opacity than that. But anyways, in my opinion, I think it looks better a lot of the time to add your individual shadows, and getting practice. If you're doing a lot of composites, practice with that is going to help regardless. So I'm going to get rid of all that. Okay, so I'm going to click on the layer mask here, and I'm going to zoom in, and the first thing I want to do is clean up the edges. So I'm going to take my white brush at 100% opacity. And again, I'm not going to take too much time cleaning up the edges, just show you how to do it, and then just kind of rush through it on my part, because it can take a while sometimes, depending on the image. And just get rid of that floor part right there. And I would go around and I would get rid of any of the original floor because I want to add in my own shadows here. There is a spot right here from the original backdrop. I don't want that there. And if you mess up, you can just switch to a black brush and paint it back on. Her hair is kind of funky. Oops, here. Just brush that back in a little bit. Bring the opacity way down just so I can do that a little bit at a time. Usually it does pretty good with hair, but sometimes there's a few patches that are a little funky on there. Okay. All right. I would maybe play with the hair a little bit there, but for tutorial's sake, I'm going to leave that. And I don't know, did I flip the backdrop? Because I didn't need to. The light was coming from the same way. So I'm going to flip it back. Okay. Now the light's coming from the same way. And now the shadows on her dress are a little bit off to match the digital. So I'm just going to come down to my background layer, and you can do this multiple ways. You could add another layer and use screen and multiply different blending modes to try to do it. I'm just going to use my dodge tool here, and I'm going to get rid of those shadows on the front of her dress a little bit. I'm going to use my on midtones. And she just needs to be a little bit brighter overall, so I'm going to add an adjustment layer for curves, and I'm just going to bring up that a little bit. And now the color is off a little, so I'm going to create another layer above her on color blending mode. I'm going to use my brush at 100% opacity. I'm going to hold down Alt on my keyboard to select the color of her dress that's correct that I want, and I'm just going to brush it over it real quick just to change that back. Sometimes using dodge and burn, it can kind of mess with the colors, so you want to paint those back in if that happens. Okay, so on the adding shadows on the backdrop, so I'm going to create a layer above the backdrop here, and I'm going to create that clipping mask so it only applies to the backdrop. Multiply blending mode. I'm going to use a brush. I'm just going to do 100% for now. I'm going to grab a shadow of the floor. In this corner over here is a shadow of the floor. And I'm just going to brush in a shadow from her body first. And I'm going to lower the opacity until it looks good. I'm going to create another layer, clip it again, multiply blending mode, and I'm going to do the shadow of the bottom of her dress. So this is going to be a thin, dark line because we're just creating that shadow where the dress meets the floor, and that's it. This is the part that takes practice. You might not get it right away, and that's fine. Sometimes I have to go back into an image and correct it, so always save your work. This is why I made the PNG overlays too, because even for me, they are a lot easier to use to add those pretty arches. And you kind of want to just feather it a little bit. Not a lot. Like don't come down and do like this big line like this to add shadow. It's not going to look realistic. You want to use a small brush and do a little bit at a time. Now I started 100% just because it's going to be a dark shadow. And you can always lower the opacity. It's harder to brush in all over again than it is to just kind of take some of the shadow away. And now up here, we're not going to have, and you can create a layer mask too and just come in and brush off. We're not going to have too much shadow up here because that's where the light is coming from. I'm actually going to create another layer. I like to do my shadows on different layers so I can work with them separately. And I'm just going to add a tiny bit of shadow there. And lower that quite a bit because it's going to be light right there. Zoom out, kind of look at it from this standpoint, and so you can see it added that shadow right under the dress. Lower the opacity just a little bit. Okay, and now you kind of want the tone of the dress to match the floor in terms of light. It's a little bit dark down here still, so I'm going to come back down, show you another way you can create another layer. On screen blending mode because we're doing light. I'm going to do about 15% opacity, and I'm going to grab a color of her dress right here, and I'm just going to paint in. See, that just added a little bit more light to that area. And when you do it that way, it doesn't change. You won't have to go back in and change the color again. I'm going to add a little bit more over here. And then we can add another layer on multiply blending mode. Grab a darker color and add some more shadow to the back of the dress there. And then I also want to add a little bit of shadow to the wall here. Not a lot because she's standing, I have her standing a little bit away from the wall. So I'm going to add another layer above the background. And it's already clipped because it's in between those layers. Multiply blending mode. Use a bigger brush so it kind of feathers. 15% is good. I'm just going to paint a little bit more shadow on there. Okay, and now if you zoom in, you can see that it is very sharp back there, the backdrop, and we don't want that because I want to create that depth. She's standing in front of the wall. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to go up to, actually, see, I'm going to go ahead and merge all of my background layers, maybe. Sometimes it messes with my shadow. Okay. And then I'm going to unclip it real quick. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to go up to filter and blur, Gaussian blur, and I usually add about 3 when they're standing kind of close. And then I'm going to create a layer mask on there, and I'm going to take a black brush at 100% opacity, And I'm just right along, I can see where I did her just because of the shadows. I'm just going to brush it off of there. And all that is going to do is just take the blur off of the field that she's standing on. I'm going to go ahead and merge those again. And then clip it. And now all that did was just add blur to the backdrop and take it off of where she's going to be standing at. And now what I like to do for these kind of composites, where's my screen? I'm going to add a little bit more light back there. Okay. Now if I'm happy with everything, I would flatten, or I would come up, I would flatten. And then I would go along the very edge, and it's just with these kind of composites that I like to do this. You don't have to. I grab my blur tool, and I go around, and I know my edges aren't perfect. I would have spent more time cleaning this up, but for tutorial sake, it's a lot faster if I leave that for after. I do the very, very edge, not in here, not anywhere there, the very, very edge of the subject, just for that creamy blur fall off to blend into the digital backdrop. I don't touch the face. Sometimes I don't even touch the hair. Usually just right by the shoulders is where I'll blend the hair. And the bottom. And this also helps it not look copy and pasted into the image. I would have went through and got rid of this dark line right here along the edge of the dress. I would have gotten rid of that a little bit too. Sometimes when I zoom in, I see more things that I want to do. Okay, I'm done. I would be happy with that. I think it looks very pretty. The only thing I might do is just come back here a little bit and mess with maybe the color. The color looks a little muddy back here just because she was on a dark backdrop before. It's always a good idea to shoot for which digital you're trying to use. I would have photographed her on a light backdrop. But obviously I'm just doing this for tutorial sake. This isn't a client of mine. I would have shot her on a backdrop similar, maybe like a bone seamless paper backdrop or something similar to try to match that, rather than the original, which I'll go back to. That was the original, and that is the edit. If you have any questions, you can message me on Etsy. If you are a studio photographer, I would love for you to join my group on Facebook. I will link it in the description.